I never thought I'd have to live through the same nightmare my mother did. But here I am, staring at my father across the dinner table as he and my aunt, yes, my mother's sister, smile at me like they aren't the villains of this story. It started when I was 16. That's when my father walked out. One day, he was there, reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, and the next, he was gone. Left a note on the counter and took his suitcase. At first, I thought maybe he just needed space, maybe he and Mom were having a fight, something that would blow over in a few days. Then I found out where he had gone. My Aunt Vanessa's house. I remember my mother's face when she found out. She didn't cry, not in front of me. She just stared at the floor for the longest time, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "Your father is with Vanessa now," she finally said, voice hollow. And that was that. They never married, Dad and Aunt Vanessa. Maybe they thought that would make it better, that it would soften the betrayal. It didn't. The worst part? They never acted like they did anything wrong. To them, love was love. "You can't help who you fall for," Dad said to me once, as if that excused what he had done. "Your mother and I weren't meant to be." Yeah, tell that to the woman you left behind. For years, I kept my distance. I saw Dad on the occasional holiday, tolerated Aunt Vanessa when I had to. But I never let them in, never let them close. I was determined not to be like him. And then, just a few months ago, everything changed. It started with a family dinner, a rare occasion where Dad, Vanessa, and I sat at the same table. The food was good, the wine was flowing, and just when I thought maybe, just maybe, I could get through the evening without resentment simmering in my chest, Vanessa leaned forward and smiled. "I see the way you look at her," she said. I frowned. "Who?" Dad and Vanessa exchanged a glance. "Clara," Dad said. "Your uncle's wife." I nearly choked on my drink. My uncle. My mother's brother. And that's when I realized my father and aunt weren't just okay with what they had done. They wanted me to do the same. I stared at them, waiting for the punchline. There had to be one, right? But they just sat there, watching me expectantly, like they had just offered me an exciting business opportunity instead of suggesting I betray my own family. "Excuse me?" I said, setting down my fork. Vanessa tilted her head, her perfectly manicured fingers swirling the wine in her glass. "Oh, come on," she said with a little laugh. "Don't act like you don't see it. The way she looks at you, the way you look at her. There's chemistry." I scoffed. "She's married." Dad shrugged like that was a minor inconvenience. "So was your mother." The casual cruelty of his words sent a chill down my spine. I leaned back in my chair, feeling suddenly suffocated. Clara. My uncle's wife. I had known her since I was a teenager. She was warm, kind, and yes, beautiful. But she was also part of my family. Well, by marriage at least. This had to be some kind of test. Maybe they wanted to see if I was one of them. If I had inherited whatever it was that made them so comfortable wrecking lives without remorse. I folded my arms. Let me get this straight. You two think it's a great idea for me to pursue my uncle's wife? Vanessa leaned forward, her expression earnest. Not just an idea. A legacy. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. A legacy? Are you listening to yourselves? Dad exhaled through his nose, as if I were being difficult. Son, listen, when I left your mother for Vanessa, people were upset at first, sure. But look at us now. We're happy. That's what matters in the end. I glanced between them, trying to figure out if they were serious. And they were. They actually believed this. Vanessa reached across the table and touched my wrist gently, her voice taking on a conspiratorial hush. We see so much of your father in you, you know. And Clara, she's been unhappy for a long time. My stomach twisted. She never said that to me. She doesn't have to, Dad said knowingly. You can feel it, can't you? And that was the worst part.
Because, deep down, I knew what they meant. Clara and I had always had an easy connection.
Whenever we saw each other at family gatherings, we really talked. Sometimes, she would touch my arm in that absent-minded way people do when they feel close to someone. Her laugh lingered a little longer when I made a joke. And there were moments, fleeting, barely noticeable moments, when her eyes would linger on me in a way that made my pulse quicken.
But I had ignored it. Dismissed it. Until now. I pushed my chair back and stood up. "This is insane," I said, shaking my head. "I'm not doing this." Dad sighed, his disappointment palpable. "Think about it." I didn't say another word. I just grabbed my coat and walked out. But the seed had been planted. And no matter how much I wanted to, I couldn't shake it. I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, hearing my father's voice, Vanessa's silky persuasion. They were both so calm, so convinced that what they were suggesting wasn't just acceptable, but inevitable. And worst of all, they had made me question something I had never questioned before. Clara. I told myself I had always seen her as just my uncle's wife. But now, my mind kept pulling up memories I had ignored, the way she'd always light up when she saw me at family gatherings, how her hand lingered a little too long on my shoulder when she greeted me, the way her laughter softened when I made a joke, like it was meant just for me. Had there always been something there? Or had Dad and Vanessa poisoned my mind? I needed clarity. And the worst part? I knew exactly where to get it. The next evening, I found myself pulling into my uncle's driveway. His house was warm and inviting, glowing with soft lights. The kind of home that made you feel at peace just by stepping inside. He and Clara had been married for 10 years, and while I wouldn't say they were madly in love, they always seemed solid. Comfortable. At least, that's what I thought. Clara opened the door before I even knocked, a smile already forming on her lips. "Hey, you." She looked beautiful. She always did. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Is my uncle home?" She shook her head. "Working late. But come in, I was just making tea." I hesitated, but then stepped inside. The moment I did, I realized my mistake. Because the house was quiet. Too quiet. It was just the two of us. And suddenly, I wasn't sure if I had come here to talk to Clara or to test myself. I stepped inside, my pulse quickening despite myself. The air smelled faintly of vanilla and something floral, Clara's perfume. I had never noticed it before, or maybe I had and just never let myself linger on the thought. "Make yourself comfortable," she said, leading me into the living room. A soft instrumental track played from a speaker, the kind of background music that made a house feel like a home. I sat on the couch while she disappeared into the kitchen. My uncle's house had always felt warm, lived in, full of little personal touches. A framed photo of their wedding sat on the coffee table. They both looked so happy in it. What was I doing here? Before I could answer that question, Clara returned with 2 mugs of tea, handing me one before curling up on the other side of the couch. "You okay?" she asked, watching me carefully. I nodded, taking a sip of the tea just to give myself a second to think. "Yeah. Just, long day." She smiled knowingly. "I get it. Life's exhausting sometimes." I glanced at her, trying to read her expression. Had she ever been unhappy in her marriage? Had she ever hinted at it? I searched for signs, for cracks in the perfect picture I had always assumed she and my uncle were. And then, before I could stop myself, I said, "Are you happy?" The question hung between us like a live wire. Clara blinked. "What?" I hesitated, but there was no taking it back now. "I mean, in your marriage. Are you happy?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at her tea, swirling it slowly. "That's a complicated question." That was all the confirmation I needed. Complicated. Not yes. Not even a forced smile or a dismissive laugh. The room felt warmer all of a sudden, and I wasn't sure if it was from the tea or the weight of what I had just uncovered.
Clara sighed and leaned back against the couch, her expression unreadable.
Why do you ask? Because my father and my aunt think I should follow in their footsteps. Because I can't stop wondering if I've been blind to something that's been in front of me all along.
Instead, I shrugged.
Just curious.
She studied me for a moment, then let out a small chuckle.
You always were a deep thinker. That laugh, that soft, private laugh, did something to me. It made me want to keep talking, to keep asking questions I shouldn't be asking. But I knew better.
I cleared my throat and set my mug down.
I should get going. Clara looked surprised. Already? I forced a smile. Yeah, early morning tomorrow.
She walked me to the door, and just as I stepped onto the porch, she reached out and touched my arm.
A light touch, nothing out of the ordinary. But this time, I felt it.
Something unspoken passed between us.
Something dangerous.
And as I drove away, I realized two things.
One, my father and Vanessa had seen something real.
And two, I wasn't sure I had the strength to resist it.
I barely slept that night.
Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed the moment Clara touched my arm, the way her eyes lingered just a little too long.
It was nothing. It had to be nothing. And yet, it didn't feel like nothing. The next few days, I tried to keep my mind occupied with work, friends, anything to keep me from thinking about her.
But then she texted me.
Clara, it was nice seeing you the other night. We should catch up more.
I stared at the message for far too long before finally replying.
Me, yeah, for sure. Let me know when you're free.
And just like that, the door was open. The next time I saw her, it wasn't at a family gathering. It wasn't in the presence of my uncle or anyone else who could serve as a barrier between us.
It was just us. She invited me for coffee. Said she had a new cafe she wanted to try.
It sounded innocent enough, but as I sat across from her, watching the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the way she leaned in when I spoke, I knew this wasn't just two relatives catching up.
It was something else entirely.
We talked about everything: life, work, dreams, regrets. She opened up in a way I had never seen before, telling me things I wasn't sure even my uncle knew. How she had once dreamed of traveling the world but had settled down instead. How she sometimes wondered what life would have been like if she had made different choices. And then, she asked the question that made my heart stop.
Do you ever feel like you're living a life you didn't really choose? I knew I should have lied.
I should have smiled and told her no, that I was exactly where I wanted to be.
But I didn't. Instead, I looked at her and said, yeah. I do.
She held my gaze for a moment too long. And that's when I knew whatever was happening between us, it wasn't just in my head.
It was real.
It was dangerous.
And I didn't know if I had the strength to stop it.
I should have stopped then. I should have cut off contact, ignored her texts, and reminded myself of the lines that shouldn't be crossed.
But I didn't.
Instead, I found myself looking forward to our conversations, our meetings that were becoming more and more frequent. It started with the occasional coffee, then late-night messages that stretched for hours. I told myself it was harmless.
We weren't doing anything wrong.
Yet, every time I saw her name light up on my phone, my heart beat faster. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late, nearly 11, when she called. "Hey," she said, her voice softer than usual.
"Are you busy?" I wasn't. But I hesitated. "What's wrong?" She sighed. I needed to talk to someone. Can we meet?" I should have said no.
But 10 minutes later, I was in my car, driving to her.
We met at a quiet park near her house.
It was empty, just the two of us sitting on a bench under the dim glow of a street lamp. She looked exhausted, her hands wrapped around herself as if she were cold.
"My marriage is falling apart," she admitted. "I don't even know who we are anymore." I swallowed hard. "Have you talked to him about it?" She let out a small, bitter laugh. "He doesn't see it. Or maybe he doesn't care."
I stayed quiet, letting her speak. She talked about the distance that had grown between them, the nights spent in separate rooms, the feeling of being alone even when he was right beside her. And then, she turned to me. "You see me," she whispered. My breath caught. I should have told her she was just feeling lonely, that she needed to work things out with my uncle. I should have walked away. But instead, I reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. A small gesture. An innocent one. Except it wasn't. Because when I did, she leaned in. And then, before I even had time to think, she kissed me. It was soft at first, hesitant, like she was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I kissed her back. And in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. I had just made the same mistake my father had. And now, there was no way out. The moment our lips parted, reality crashed down on me like a tidal wave. Clara's eyes widened, her breath shaky. She started, but she didn't finish. Because neither of us had the words for what had just happened. I stepped back, running a hand through my hair. My heart was pounding, not just from the kiss, but from what it meant. This wasn't something we could brush off. This wasn't just a fleeting mistake. This was the start of something dangerous. "I should go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Clara hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, okay." She didn't try to stop me. But as I walked back to my car, I could still taste her on my lips. And despite the guilt clawing at my chest, part of me wanted more. The next morning, I woke up with a pit in my stomach. I kept telling myself it was a one-time thing, a moment of weakness. But when my phone buzzed, my heart nearly stopped. "Clara, can we talk?" I stared at the message, my mind racing. What was there to talk about? We both knew what had happened. We both knew it shouldn't have. But I wanted to see her. More than that, I needed to. I told myself I was going just to clear the air, to set boundaries. To make sure we didn't make the same mistake again. But when I met her later that night, boundaries were the last thing on my mind. She was waiting for me outside a small diner on the outskirts of town, her arms wrapped around herself like she was shielding herself from the cold or from what we had done. I walked up slowly, unsure of what to say. But before I could speak, she did. "I can't stop thinking about it," she admitted. My stomach twisted. "Clara." "I know it's wrong," she cut me off. But it didn't feel wrong. I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. "It can't happen again." She nodded, but there was something in her eyes that made me doubt her agreement. And deep down, I knew. I didn't believe myself either. Because this wasn't over. It was just beginning. We told ourselves we'd stop. But we didn't. One meeting turned into two. Coffee became long walks, stolen moments in places where no one would see us. And then, when that wasn't enough, the secrecy deepened. Late-night drives. Lingering touches. A shared glance across the room at family gatherings that sent a rush through my veins. I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. Someone who checked his phone obsessively for her messages. Someone who craved the thrill of knowing we were playing with fire. And Clara, she had changed too. At first, she hesitated, torn between guilt and desire. But over time, the guilt faded, replaced by something else. A kind of reckless abandon. One night, after another late meeting in her car, she exhaled and let her head fall back against the seat. "I feel alive when I'm with you," she murmured. I didn't know how to respond. Because I felt it too. And that terrified me. Then came the night that shattered everything. It was my cousin's birthday, a big family party at my uncle's house. I wasn't going to go, but skipping it would have raised suspicions. So I went. I told myself it would be fine. I told myself I could handle it. But the second I stepped into the house and saw Clara across the room, wearing a simple navy dress that hugged her in all the right places, I knew I had made a mistake. She caught my eye and gave me the smallest smile, one no one else would notice. But I did. And my stomach flipped. I forced myself to focus on anything but her. The food. The conversations. My uncle, who clapped me on the back and asked how work was going, completely oblivious. But then, it happened. I was in the kitchen, grabbing a drink, when Clara slipped inside. No one else was around. She stood close, too close. I shouldn't have come, I whispered. She smiled, just a little. Then why did you? Her perfume was intoxicating, her presence overwhelming. I should have walked away. I should have put an end to this before it spiraled any further. But before I could say anything, my uncle walked in. Clara and I stepped apart so fast, I nearly knocked over a glass. "Hey, you two," he said, completely unaware of the tension in the room. "What's going on?" Clara's face was unreadable. "Just grabbing a drink." I forced a laugh, gripping the counter so hard my knuckles turned white. But as I looked at my uncle, the man whose trust one was betraying, I realized something. We weren't careful anymore. And if we weren't careful, someone was going to find out. After that night, something shifted. We had been reckless, too reckless. And for the first time, it felt like the walls were closing in. Clara must have felt it too because she became more cautious. She stopped texting as often. Stopped suggesting we meet. At family gatherings, she barely looked at me. It should have been a relief. It wasn't. The silence was unbearable. The distance between us felt like a knife twisting in my gut. I tried to go about my life as if nothing had happened. I threw myself into work, hung out with friends, even went on a few dates, trying to convince myself that I could move on. But it was a lie. Because every time my phone buzzed, my heart still jumped, hoping it was her. Every time I walked into a room, I searched for her face. Then, one evening, out of nowhere, she called. I answered immediately. "Clara?" Her breathing was shaky. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered. A lump formed in my throat. "I know. I love him," she said, almost like she was trying to convince herself. "I do. But I can't stop thinking about you." I closed my eyes. "Clara, we have to stop." Silence. Then. "Meet me." I should have said no. But I didn't. We met at a hotel. It was the only place that felt safe, away from prying eyes. The second I walked through the door, she was in my arms, and every ounce of restraint I had left disappeared. That night, we crossed the final line. And there was no going back. Afterward, as she lay beside me, tracing circles on my arm, she whispered, "What now?" I didn't have an answer. Because for the first time, I realized something terrifying. I wanted her. Not in secret. Not in stolen moments. I wanted her to be mine. But wanting her meant breaking apart an entire family. And if we weren't careful, that was exactly what was going to happen. The beginning of the end came sooner than I expected. A week after that night in the hotel, I got a text from Clara. "We need to talk. It's important." My stomach twisted as I drove to meet her. Something felt wrong. When I arrived, she was pacing in the dimly lit parking lot, arms wrapped around herself. The moment she saw me, she whispered, "He knows." The ground beneath me seemed to shift. "What?" "My husband," she said, her voice shaking. "He found out." I felt like I had been punched in the chest. "How?" She exhaled, her hands trembling. "He saw my phone. A message I forgot to delete. He confronted me last night." Panic surged through me. "Did you tell him everything?" I tried to deny it at first, she admitted, looking down. But he knew. I couldn't lie to his face. So I told him. I ran a hand through my hair, my pulse racing. This wasn't just about us anymore. This was about my entire family. "He's furious," Clara continued. "But he hasn't told anyone yet. He said he needs time to think." That gave me little comfort.
My uncle wasn't the type to let things go. Eventually, the truth would spread, and when it did, the fallout would be catastrophic.
I stared at Clara, at the woman I had risked everything for.
The woman I had told myself I wouldn't fall for. And yet, I had. "What do we do?" I asked. She hesitated, then whispered, "I don't know." But deep down, I did. This was never going to stay a secret forever.
And now, there was only one thing left to do: face the consequences.
Because the truth was out. And there was no taking it back.